about a minute for the first flow of people to come in, and after that I'll start recording, and then I'll introduce you, and then you can take it.
Should I share my screen now or later? Maybe later.
Maybe yeah. I think this is coming in. Okay, thank you, Mr. Keshav. Thanks for starting the recording. Please share the recording with me once the webinar is over. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today, this evening, and welcome to the second inspiration lecture in fall 2021. We have with us today Professor Devashish Mitra from Syracuse University, and the topic of his lecture is international trade, jobs, and growth in India. A little introduction about Professor Mitra. Professor Devashish Mitra is a professor of economics, and Gerald B. and Daphna Kramer, professor of global affairs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He was the chair of the economics department at Syracuse University from 2006 to 2010. Professor Mitra is the co-editor of Economics and Politics and Indian Growth and Development Review. In addition, he has been the associate editor of the European Economic Review from 2012 to 2015, Journal of Development Economics since 2010, Journal of International Economics from 2006 to 15, International Journal of Business and Economics since 2004, and International Review of Economics and Finance from 2011 to 2019. He's also a member of the editorial board of the Review of International Economics, ISRN Economics, Economies and Finance India. He's also a member of the trade program of the International Growth Center UK, based at the LSE and Oxford, a fellow of the CSIFO network, a research professor at the IFO Institute, Munich, and a research fellow at the IZA Bonn. Professor Mitra's research and teaching interests are in international trade, political economy, and development economics. More specifically, he has worked on the role of politics in general and of interest groups in particular in the determination of trade policy and on the impact of trade on productivity growth and labor market outcomes. He's currently working on the impact of trade on employment, unionization, and informality, as well as on the economics and politics of populism. His work has been published in well-known journals like the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Economic Journal, Games and Economic Behavior, the Journal of International Economics, and the Journal of Development Economics. Professor Mitra is also a commentator on Indian economic policy issues, and these opinion pieces have been published in well-known news outlets such as Indian Express, Economic Times, Live Mint, India Today, etc. Before I leave the stage to Professor Mitra, there are some very simple, very few housekeeping rules. Please, all of you who are attending this, please keep this in mind. Make sure that your webcam and your mic is muted at all time. If you have any question, you can write down your question in the Q&A box or in the chat box. At the end of the lecture, Professor Mitra will take your questions. So these were the only housekeeping rules. I will now leave the stage to Professor Mitra. Professor Mitra, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Chitrakalpa, for a very kind introduction. It's a pleasure here to speak in your inspiration lecture series. Thanks for your invitation. Let me first share the screen, my screen with you. One second, I got the wrong one. Is my screen visible now? On international trade, the PowerPoint?
No, the browser is visible.
Oh, I see. Let me stop share and then again share. Okay. All right. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is visible now.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. All right, so, as you can see on my screen, the title of my talk is International Trade, Jobs and Growth in India. It's not based on any particular paper. It's based on basically a lot of my work in the past, including some of the, uh, opinion pieces I've written, as well as some of my research. All right, so basically, yeah, what I'm going to focus on is the twin problems of slow job creation and slow economic growth in India. Now, earlier the problem was mainly of slow job creation, but now more recently we also have the growth problem. So let me start with something that you may have heard a lot about, the demographic dividend, and this is basically the situation, or the period of time when you have the size of the working age population 15 to 64 years old greater than the rest of the population, right? It means that you have a bigger population producing goods and services, and there's a smaller population to feed who are not able to work. Either they are children or they're older people who are retired. All right. So, and that's the, and during that period, normally we've seen that growth has accelerated. So if you look at East Asian countries, we see that growth accelerated during the demographic dividend. India is in the first stage of this demographic dividend, just the early stages. Now, in the Indian case, if we look at, these are numbers from the 2017 economic survey. So if you look at the 8 labor-intensive sectors like textile, apparel, leather, gemstones, jewelry, all those kinds of things, ITES, BPO, you find that only 135,000 jobs, 135,000 jobs were created, were added in 2015 in these sectors. These are labor-intensive sectors, and some of them are export-oriented sectors. And now compare that with the actual addition to the working age population during the same period. It was 10 million. So, when you have this demographic dividend, you're adding a lot of people in the working age group every year. So you have to create jobs for them if you have to have growth. So it's not like, once you are in that phase, you're going to get growth automatically. So often this demographic dividend becomes a demographic burden, or sometimes people call it a demographic curse. So so this is basically the challenge that India faces right now. Apart from the thing about the pandemic, I'm not going to talk a lot about the pandemic. All right. So I'm hoping that's a shorter run problem. Even if it becomes endemic, it's good, to bring it under control and manage it would be a thing. To bring it under control is a shorter run problem, and managing it in the future is the long run problem. But my focus is not going to be on the pandemic. All right. So there's the other thing is that it's not only creating jobs. It's not just the number. It's also the quality of jobs. So if you look at the 3-year action agenda from the Niti Aayog in 2017, here are some very interesting numbers. So in India, agriculture employs about half of the workforce, all right? But it only generates about a fifth, 20% of the national income. So which means that the per capita income in India is about 2.5 times the average agricultural income. All right. So now the other thing to note is that if you look at employment in small firms that employ less than 20 workers, 20 or fewer workers, less than or equal to 20 workers. These firms actually employ 75% of all manufacturing workers. I mean, we are combining informal sector enterprises with formal sector firms and then doing these calculations. Not we, but the Niti Aayog did. Now you compare with and then look at their manufacturing output. It's approximately 10% of overall manufacturing output. All right, so they're employing 75% of all manufacturing workers, but producing only 10% of the total manufacturing output in India. It's a similar situation in the service sector. Now, if you look, then you have the informal sector and you have the formal sector. So if you compare the average wage in the formal sector, it's about 6 times the average wage in the informal sector. So what does it tell us? That a lot of the jobs in India are not high-paying, high-quality jobs. There is scope for more growth by actually improving job quality. Apart from creating more jobs, we need to create more high-quality jobs. All right. So it's not what I mean is not higher quality jobs. We need more of the higher quality jobs. All right. So we need more of the high quality jobs. So here is so there is basically scope for increasing the number of jobs. India needs more jobs, but it just doesn't need any kind of jobs. Like, it doesn't need informal sector jobs. It needs, formal sector jobs in the manufacturing sector. I'll come to that in a minute. Talking about informality, I mean, how bad is the problem? If you look at the share of the informal sector in overall non-agricultural employment, it's close to 84%. Now, what the ILO did was it basically tried to predict the share of the informal sector based on India's per capita income level and based on India's stage of development. So the predicted share is 60%. So, as the country develops, the proportion of the informal sector in the economy should shrink. All right. And so at India's stage of development, at its level of per capita income, based on the regression that they ran, it was supposed to be 60%. So India is above that regression line quite a bit. It's 24 percentage points higher than what it should be. If you look at Brazil, Costa Rica, Uruguay, same incidence of poverty as India, you see that they have higher per capita income levels. The informal sector share is 40%. Look at Uganda, lower per capita income level, same poverty incidence. It's the share of the informal sector is 69.4%. So now China is far ahead in terms of per capita income, so it's at a higher stage of economic development. But still, people like to make India-China comparisons, and you see that Chinese share of the informal sector is about 33%. So India is certainly, in terms of the share of its informal sector, is not performing, consistent with its overall development, overall per capita income level. It's the share of the informal sector is very high. Clearly shows that there is scope for improvement in this area, and this is also a way of illustrating the problem of creating quality jobs, it's not happening in India. All right. So when people say that, you know, you have a neighborhood uh, uh, street vendor or a street hawker, and that is an equally good job as any other job, you know, that there is this problem, that which is that those are not, they don't pay the same amount. As I said, the 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 average income of an informal sector worker is about one-sixth of a formal sector worker. So this basically stresses all the numbers that I've given you basically tell us the importance of structural change for growth, for job create, and for creation of quality jobs. All right. And what we need is not any kind of structural change, but we need growth enhancing structural change. So what does growth enhancing structural change mean? If, you know, certain sectors have higher productivity, labor productivity, and therefore have higher average incomes, we need workers to move from the lower productivity sectors to those higher productivity sectors. So even if there is no technological change in these individual sectors, people are just moving from the low productivity sectors to the high productivity sectors, overall productivity in the economy as a whole will rise, and therefore the average income will rise, and therefore you're going to see growth at the economy-wide level. All right. So what are the different ways in which we can get growth enhancing structural change? Structural change, as the name suggests, is you get a change in the structure of the economy. All right. So one is, of course, reduction in informality. The share of the formal sector should rise, and the informal sector should shrink. And the other thing is basically manufacturing. The manufacturing sector should, the share of the manufacturing sector should rise relative to agriculture, because, as I mentioned, average agricultural income is about 40% of the average per capita income in India. All right. So if you move to a more productive sector where, you know, average incomes are higher, you're going to get growth. All right. So the question is, why is the structural change not taking place? And I'll come to that in a minute. But the employment generating structural change. So I talked about the growth enhancing structural change. All right, reduction in informality, expansion in manufacturing relative to agriculture. But we are dealing with the twin problems of growth and jobs, right? So what do we view as employment generating structural change? One would be the expansion of labor intensive sectors. You know that India is a labor abundant economy. It has, and the way we know that India is a labor abundant economy is that, you know, it has the share of India's share in world population is about 17%, but its share in world GDP is 3%. So when the share of the labor force in the world economy India's share is so much greater than its share in overall GDP, you know, which is just 3%, 17% as opposed to 3%, we would, you know, this would easily be classified as a labor abundant economy. So its natural, comparative advantage should be in labor intensive sectors. All right. So, which means that India needs to specialize in some of these sectors to export more. I will also kind of argue later in this talk that, you know, the key to higher growth is going to be export growth. All right. The other thing is about the firm is about firm size. And you'll see, with the evidence that I'll present, you'll see that India's, compared to China, for example, or many other developing countries, India mainly, most of the manufacturing output, especially labor-intensive manufacturing output, is concentrated in small firms. So if you compare with China, while India's manufacturing output is mainly concentrated in firms that employ 20 or fewer workers, China's manufacturing output is concentrated in firms with 1,000 or more workers. Clearly, they're going to have more economies of scale, and it's not rocket science to figure out that they have a comparative advantage in many of the labor-intensive activities, precisely because their firms are larger, they're reaping bigger economies of scale. All right, so let me go back to India's growth experience from during this period 1951 to 2012, and then I'll come to the later years after I'm done with this, the last decade. You can clearly see that the GDP growth in the first 15 years right after independence wasn't that bad, 4.1%. Now, of course, you have to realize that India was, a British colony, so it was under the British rule for about 150 years. And the way it was colonized was, when a trading company approached, and started trading, the East India Company started trading with India, and that got later converted into the formal British rule. So clearly, it was natural for our leaders to be a little skeptical of trade. All right. And so on top of that, if you look at the economics literature of that time, it was kind of viewed that trade was good only for developed countries. For developing countries, there was, they had to go through a period of infant industry protection, and all the big economic thinkers were of the view that trade was not the best for for developing countries, for their growth or for their employment generation or whatever things you can think about. So when people kind of blame Nehru for starting with a very closed economy, you have to keep that in mind. India just became independent. It was under British rule, which was started by a trading company. On top of that, in the formal economics literature, trade wasn't viewed as something good for developing countries. All right. Despite that, right after independence, India started with more or less a fairly open economy. All right. Both in terms of trade and foreign direct investment, it was not so bad. It was only in the late 50s that there was some foreign exchange problems, so they had to ration that foreign exchange. Because of that, you can see that the growth rate was about 4.1%, which compared to zero, during the last 2 or 3 decades of the British rule, which meant the negative per capita income growth. So that was a big improvement. But the real closeness of the Indian economy came after 1965, especially when Indira Gandhi was the prime minister. You had a lot of tariff increases, import tariffs went up, plus import licensing was started in a big way. And a lot of things were, you couldn't just import, right? There were import bans on a lot of products, apart from the fact that, you had 200, 300% duties on many things like automobiles. So there were, the only goods you were allowed to import were things that were just not produced in India. India didn't have the technology to produce. So, you could basically import cars, but you could import cars at very, very high import duties. On top of that, there were, the labor laws were made very stringent. It was difficult to hire and fire, virtually impossible for firms with more than 100 workers to hire and fire workers. Actually, to hire workers, to fire workers. So if you had employed someone, then even if the worker was seen to be incompetent or there was a reduction in demand for the product, you couldn't fire that worker. And because firms knew that, if they hired an additional worker, it was going to be almost impossible to fire, they didn't hire more workers. So as I will argue, a lot of firms actually use very capital intensive methods of production so that they didn't depend on labor, because hiring labor had its costs. All right. Also, they couldn't reassign workers from one task to another. So these are all part of our labor laws, and some of them exist to varying extents even today. All right. So that's, and you see the drop in the growth rate during the period 1965 to 1981, went down to 3.2%, and the per capita income growth rate was below 1%. Now, towards the late 70s, policymakers realized that this closeness in trade is not working very well. You need, more openness in trade, meaning there was the open general license list of products, which is basically you would be able to import goods at reduced tariff rates. That started expanding towards the late 70s. A lot of goods, especially capital and intermediate goods, were included, especially goods. Basically, there were goods that India was still not producing. So the tariffs on those were were reduced to a very low level. And so there was some expansion in trade, but it was still there. Trade was still pretty closed. There were no changes in labor laws, the labor regulations that I talked about, which had restrictions on firing workers, which got converted implicitly on restrictions in hiring workers, because firms didn't want to hire workers who they knew couldn't be fired at any cost. But you see some improvement in 81 to 88. The other reason for improvement in the growth rate was that the government spent pretty irresponsibly during that period. There was, which resulted in the early 90s in a macroeconomic crisis. I'm coming to that in a moment, but basically some opening, some other kinds of liberalization in taxes and so on during the 80s. Some minor economic reforms started during the period, which led to a higher growth rate, but also it was a macroeconomic policy. It was a little bit of the fiscal policy was quite irresponsible, but what it did was that increase in spending, had this Keynesian effect. It led to higher growth. But by 1990, so you see the 4.6% GDP growth and 2.4% per capita GDP growth. But by 1990, there's the macroeconomic problems assumed crisis-like proportions, meaning that the debt to GDP ratio was very high. The debt service ratio, which is the proportion of your export earnings that will be used to service debt, became really high. 27% of export earnings were being used to pay off debts. The government was using to pay off debts, which is not a productive use of export earnings. And then, India didn't even have a month's worth of foreign exchange, foreign exchange to pay for a month's worth of imports. And so, India did need to import a lot of essential things. And then there was this oil price shock and all those things, which basically meant that India had to go to the IMF for, financial assistance. And those, the IMF gave India financial assistance, but under the, strong conditionality of economic reforms, the main component of which was trade reforms. And you had big reductions in tariffs. You had tariffs of over 300%. The top tariffs were, they were brought down to 100% and then 50% over time, and then down to 10% and so on, and then even 5%. But there were some exceptions, which, so this is the top tariff I'm talking about is except for things in agriculture. Agricultural tariff was still very high. And then automobiles, the tariffs are still, today they are, somewhere between, they vary depending on the type of automobile, between 60 and 125%. The parts, the tariff on automobile parts is about 12.5%. There were also, artificial fibers where, the tariff is really high, 25 to 30%. So, those exceptions are there, but, barring those exceptions, tariffs were liberalized over a few years, starting in 1991. And then apart from tariffs being liberalized, there was, early 2000s, there was privatization, there was infrastructure building, then telecom reforms and so on. So under the, Narasimha Rao regime and then the Atal Bihari Vajpayee regime, India had a lot of liberalization. And for about another 10 years after that, we see pretty high growth as a result of, liberalization during the, as a result of the Rao Vajpayee reforms. All right. So you can clearly see that 88 to 2003, the growth rate was about 5.9, close to 6%. Per capita income growth was about close to 4%. So big jump in growth. All right. And then this period, 2003 to 12, was average growth was over 8%. So for almost a decade, average growth was over 8%. Per capita income growth was close to 7%. So this is basically, this was the best decade in terms of average economic performance. This was probably the best decade. And a lot of it owes to the reforms during the Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee regimes. All right. So in the current decade, if you look at India's growth, 2010 is about 8.5%, you can see, right? But then 2011, it fell down to close to 5%, and then again, slowly picked up. And here, it again went back to about over 8% in 2016. But 2016 onwards, India's growth rate has been going southwards. All right. And this is the pre-pandemic. So what I've the numbers that I'm giving you are pre-pandemic, because it's hard to talk about any kind of good economic policy based on growth rates and employment numbers during a pandemic. All right. We just assume that those numbers are temporary, but this number is 5% here. During the pandemic, it went down to negative 27% and so on. And then now it started going to, it's in positive territory now. But the base is a lot smaller as a result of the output loss during the pandemic. But all said and done, you can clearly see that in the past few years, the growth rate has kept going down, and India's growth performance has not been that great. All right. So, it's fairly obvious that openness. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that, foreign investment also has opened up, and also during the 1990s and early 2000s, you had some foreign investment reforms. And so it's fairly obvious that openness in trade and foreign investment, if you look at India's economic history post-independence, you'll realize that openness in trade and foreign investment had a role to play in delivering, greater than 8% growth during 2003 and to 2012. During 2010 to 19, during the last decade, we see that 3 out of 10 years had growth rates of 8% or higher. 7 out of the 10 years had growth rates of 6% or higher. But the remaining 3 years had, and that's, more of the recent past, the last 5 years had a growth rate, that is touching 5%. So had a growth rate between 5 and 6%. And now, and it turned negative during the pandemic, but then started to turn positive recently. So the growth rates, while the growth rates have been rising, declining, unemployment has been rising. All right. If you look at the unemployment rates, the unemployment rates also crossed 6% during the last few years, prior to the pandemic, which is on top of that, if you look at the labor force participation rate, that was really low at 37%. So a low labor force participation rate, meaning that the working age population is 15 to 64. Out of that, only 37% of the people are either working or looking for jobs. And and then even though the labor force participation rate is so low, you still have a high unemployment rate. And these are pre-pandemic numbers. So during the pandemic, it's hard to tell how high the unemployment rate must have gone. But this is a period of, growth rates since 2016. It's a period of growth rates declining and unemployment rising. And recent export performance has also been very unsatisfactory. The export to GDP ratio has been falling, and trade policy has been turning more and more protectionist. I'm going to talk about that later. So, this is based on some of the work I've done with one of my former PhD students, Rashad Hassan, who is now an associate professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And so what we did was we tried to study the structural change that has taken place in India over, the last 50 years or so. All right. I'm saying 50 years because we don't go beyond 2010 in that study. The study starts 1960. So we are looking at different sectors like, finance, real estate and business, construction, retail, manufacturing, mining, construction, agriculture, and so on. There are 9 sectors. And it turns out that, as you would expect, labor productivity is the highest in finance, real estate, and business services. Okay. The problem is that only a very small proportion of the population can work in those sectors because they just don't have the skills or the levels of education required to work in those sectors. But if you look at labor productivity in all these sectors, it turns out that it's the lowest in agriculture. Now, manufacturing is also towards the bottom on that list, but it's still 4 times, its labor productivity is about 4 times labor productivity in agriculture. All right. So clearly, as I mentioned, half the population is in agriculture, half the labor force is in agriculture. So there is a lot of scope for growth enhancing structural change. Now, in India's economic history post-independence, barring the 1970s, structural change has always made a positive contribution to overall productivity growth. What does this mean? It means that on average, people have been moving from less productive sectors to more productive sectors, sectors where labor productivity is on average low, to sectors where labor productivity is high. So this movement itself is going to generate growth because that's going to increase per capita income in the economy. So, but within sector growth, that is the growth rate that takes place, the productivity growth that takes place within a sector because of technological improvements or higher efficiency due to other reasons, always made a positive contribution. And since 1980, within sector growth has been a bigger contributor to growth than structural change. All right. So these are features of the of structural change, the relative contribution of structural change and within sector growth to overall growth. So and as I said, for the most part, structural change has been growth enhancing. So what are the determinants of structural change in India? So one way to see whether we are having the desirable kind of structural change or the growth enhancing structural change is to see whether a sector's employment share is positively correlated to its productivity or not. Meaning that if more productive sectors are increasing their employment share, then you're going to get overall growth. All right. So the change. So what we find in our research is that the change in a sector's employment share within a state is related positively to its productivity, meaning that the more productive sectors are increasing their employment share. So this is a good kind of structural change, growth enhancing structural change. And this positive relationship between a sector's employment share and its productivity, this is stronger after the 1991 reforms and is stronger in the states of India, which are more exposed to foreign competition by virtue of employment composition. What do we mean? In the literature, there is, we've done some work on poverty using this kind of measure. Petya Topalova is another person, but it has been used in other studies on Brazil and many other countries, where you create this index of openness by states. The tariff is the vector of tariffs, or all the tariffs are applicable, are common to all states because it's done at the national level. The import tariffs, the import duties. But you can create a measure of openness of each state by looking at their employment shares and using those as weights to create an average tariff rate for every state. All right. This measure tells us gives us a sense of how exposed. It's an inverse measure of how exposed a state is, or a state's workers are, to foreign competition. All right. So it's the employment composition that is different across states, even though each state faces the same vector of uh, uh, import tariffs, but because the weights are different, you know, you will see different changes in this weighted average of tariffs over time. All right, even though we make sure that we we use just the initial year weights, because the weights might respond to tariffs, and that's not a good thing in your econometric analysis. But basically, this measure gives you a sense of how exposed a state is, the workers in a state are to uh, foreign competition. And we see that the relationship, that positive relationship between a sector's employment share and its productivity is stronger after the 1991 reforms, and in states that are more exposed to foreign competition by virtue of their employment composition. So basic idea is, the basic conclusion that we are arriving at is that openness to trade promotes growth enhancing structural change. We also kind of find that trade restrictions, restrictive labor regulations, lack of basic education, low road density, low road connectivity, all these are things that impede this growth enhancing structural change. All right. This relationship between the positive relationship between a sector's employment share and its productivity is much weaker when you see greater trade restrictions, more restrictive labor regulations. That relationship is weaker when you have these bigger trade restrictions and more restrictive labor regulations, when you don't have basic education, when road density, road connectivity is poor, and so on. So in other words, the basic, the bottom line from this slide is that labor market flexibility and trade openness will help with generating growth enhancing structural change. All right. So apart from that, if we go back to some of the micro level evidence, there was a long time ago, I wrote a paper that was published in the JDE in 1998. This is a paper that I co-authored with Praveen Krishna at Johns Hopkins University. So we find that, there is some evidence of increase in productivity, firm productivity growth as a result of the trade reforms. And later, Petya Topalova and Amit Khandelwal, that use more state-of-the-art econometric techniques, which were developed after, our paper was published. Those techniques which were developed after our paper got published. I mean, they use those techniques, and they use longer, their data covered a longer time span, and they confirm an increase in firm level productivity due to trade liberalization. And more recently, with respect to the issue of jobs, Rashad Hassan and Arpita Chatterjee, in their paper in the Journal of International Economics in 2017, they find that trade liberalization leads to greater occupational mobility. So what they look at is they compare the son's job with the father's job. It's very difficult, given the data, to compare the daughter's job with the mother's job, or the father's job, because with the NSSO data, you can look at families, and it's the son. Normally, in many cases, the son, with joint families, the son remains with the parents, right? Or the parents live with their son, And so you can observe what they wanted to observe, but the daughter moves to another family, so it's very difficult to track. Uh, compare the mother's job with the daughter's job. But what they look at is that, well, what is the kind of job the son has, whether that is something that requires more education, more skills. So on the basis of that, they do a ranking of jobs, and they find that, in an urban district with a greater exposure to trade liberalization, by that I mean the same kind of measure that I talked about, the labor force is more exposed to foreign competition. So, there is upward mobility in those kinds of urban districts that have a greater exposure to trade liberalization. All right, so they see upward intergenerational mobility in those kinds of sectors. So one can provide some economic intuition for the results that are seen. One is that, we know of the standard trade theory where we expect welfare gains from trade due to efficiency gains. You specialize in goods in which you have a comparative advantage, but that is also followed by some kind of exchange. So there are gains from specialization as well as gains from exchange that lead to a higher welfare level, which means higher real income. And also, trade leads to the availability of a larger variety of final goods. So people can have a larger variety, consumption of larger variety leads to a higher welfare level, again, would be reflected in real incomes, but also there is a better match between one's preferences and the type of variety one needs when there are more varieties available. With a greater variety of intermediate inputs, productivity rises through the possibility of greater division of labor and also better input and output matching. And then, there is also this issue of weeding out the least productive firms through more competition due to trade, but the most productive firms actually find export markets, and they also enhance their share at the expense of the less productive firms that remain. They basically, among the firms that survive, there are some the least productive firms actually reduce their market share because of the competition they face. So the most productive firms, expand their market share at the expense of everyone else. And as a result, the average productivity in every industry goes up. There are other things like exchange of technical information through trade. There's, elimination of duplication of research efforts. So global effort research becomes more efficient, and there is more competition, which incentivizes producers to innovate, managers to act more efficiently, and so on. And then the occupational mobility issue, is that firms face more competition. They are forced to improve their quality. Remember, earlier, before trade liberalization, the Ambassador car was using a 1913 steering wheel. And there were only, there was Ambassador, Fiat, and later Maruti came in with its smaller car. But, there was very little competition in the automobile industry. So, car manufacturers knew that they could give us very low quality products at fairly high prices, and because there was no competition. So when there is more competition, quality has to be higher. So they need more skilled workers. So there's the demand for skilled workers goes up. That may generate intergenerational mobility. So also firms at the frontier are going to expand, are going to hire more. They're going to expand. Other firms, they face less competition, and they are the ones that employ the less educated, less skilled workers. So, and they're going to shrink. So that basically forms the intuition for occupational mobility driven by trade. And there might be other channels, and one can think of other channels, but due to limited time, I'll just restrict myself there. If you look at India's export performance, right, starting 1990s, it kept growing, and and then it remained roughly constant at 25% between 2006 and 2013. But after that, it has been declining, and so that is a real problem. And you can clearly see that this period is also, when we have been stuck at this 20% level, and then now we're going even below that, is the period of low growth and high unemployment. So as I mentioned, starting in 2016, growth started declining, and by 2019 fell to 5% prior to the start of the pandemic, right? And then the unemployment rate crossed 6%, with a labor participation rate of 37%. But apart from what you see in the data, there's also a problem of underemployment, which is that which has always been true, which is that some work, a given piece of work that can be done by one worker is performed by 3-4 workers. So basically, workers are underemployed, and this has been a characteristic of India's employment, even when growth rates were very high. All right, so and also India's growth has mainly been service sector driven, and labor intensive manufacturing like textiles, apparel, footwear have had no role to play. And with India's level of skills of the workforce, this kind of growth based on the services sector is not very sustainable. You have to have growth based on labor intensive manufacturing. Also, though, that kind of growth creates more jobs and quality jobs if it happens in the formal sector. And if you look at South Korea, Taiwan, China, their rapid growth was actually driven by labor intensive manufacturing. All right, so they had rapid growth and rapid creation of well-paying jobs simultaneously. So one is, we need more tariff liberalization. The last few years have seen basically increase in tariffs, doubling of tariffs on things like, labor intensive things like footwear, candles, kites, beauty aids. A lot of labor intensive products have seen doubling of tariffs. We've also seen doubling of tariffs in things like, electronic and communication products like, mobile phones, TV sets, and all their components. Putting tariffs on those kinds of components is bad for, input processing and assembly, which was basically an engine of growth in China, both growth in economic output and income, as well as jobs. And on top of that, this is one area where the reforms have been reversed in the last 4 or 5 years, and clearly, our exports have been going down. Now, some people believe that you could do Make in India for both exports as well as our domestic needs. That cannot happen. We have limited resources. If you put more resources in satisfying domestic demand, you'll have less resources left for exports, right? Because resources are limited, plain and simple. Also, if you basically reduce, if you want to satisfy all of domestic consumption through domestic production, you're going to reduce your demand for foreign exchange. So let's say then the dollar will become cheaper relative to the rupee, which means rupee becomes more expensive relative to the dollar, which makes our goods more expensive in dollar terms in the rest of the world, and our exports go down, right? So this is basically plain learner symmetry theorem, which says that a tax on imports is a tax on exports. You cannot have, import barriers and hope to increase exports. And as we've clearly seen, that our exports to GDP ratio and our growth rates are positively correlated. So if we are driving down our exports to GDP growth through our policy, then through trade policy, then obviously it's going to be very difficult for the growth rate to go up. All right. One of the problems is factor market reforms. We haven't had a lot of that. Recently, we've seen some of it, which is raising the threshold for firing workers from 100 workers to 300 workers in many states. We've also seen, some setting up of web-based portals for, reporting of compliance with labor laws, which, if the government finds any inconsistency in compliance with different laws, only then will there be a manual inspection. And Rajasthan has increased the threshold for forming a union. It should have at least 30% of employees, all of that, but still there's, a lot of scope for improvement there. That threshold of 300 workers in many states needs to be increased to about 1,000 workers. We are competing with China, that, where most of the production is concentrated in 1,000+ worker firms. Recently the government has merged these labor laws into 4 codes, but unless the actual laws, the regulations change, consolidating laws into fewer codes doesn't make a lot of difference. You ultimately have the same laws. There's a lot of scope for liberalization of labor laws, and apart from that, there is also the issue of land. Land acquisition has been a real problem. Because of that, I, with my co-author Priyaranjan Jha at UC Irvine, have pushed for autonomous economic zones, kind of like the Shenzhen in China, where in Shenzhen, you basically, they have this special economic zone, about 1,900 square kilometers, serving a population of 13 million. We have these SEZs, or special economic zones, in India, which have like an area of 0.3 square kilometers each. And there's one in Gujarat, I think it's Mundra, which is about 50 square kilometers. It's one of the biggest ones in India. It's way smaller than Shenzhen. And one of the things that you can do is you can have some flexibility in labor laws, land laws. You can actually have more high-rise buildings where production can take place, because there's the floor space index, there's a restriction in many cities in India, and you can do away with those probably in those AEZs, or autonomous economic zones, along with relaxed, more flexible labor laws, which will allow for also a living minimum wage. And there are some states in India that have temporarily said that they'll do away with all labor laws, including some kinds of minimum wage and other kinds of laws and regulations on working conditions, and so on. And that's not good for the workers. All right. So we are certainly saying that those minimum wages need to be, a living wage has to be given to workers. They should have good work conditions, and so on. But then there should be some flexibility in firing workers as needed. And if you have a lot of, what this could do is it could act as a coordinating device to agglomerate firms in those areas, so that if one worker loses his or her job in one firm, you can quickly move to another firm that needs more workers. So if you have all firms agglomerated, also input, the suppliers will be close by and so on. So, and in the short run, there's going to be a lot of construction, create more jobs. And this is actually very important post-pandemic, where the economy needs to restart. You need to set up these AEZs. All right, free trade agreements. India has not been participating in free trade agreements. It decided not to be a signatory to RCEP. That's, I think, not good in my opinion, because the problem really is these factor market laws, right? So if you don't enter, so these agreements will create the need for these factor market reforms. But if you don't sign on to these agreements, there's no need for the factor market reform. So you're stuck in a bad policy equilibrium trap. A lot of economists have argued for more uniform tariffs. You might have some revenue needs, so you need some tariffs, but a more uniform tariffs is good because it'll be subject to less lobbying, but also, it would, if there's a difference between output tariffs on the output imported and inputs imported, it can offer differential protection. Also, that differential protection means that there is a scope to get higher protection than other industries. So there's going to be a lot of lobbying. But if there is a uniform tariff, then there is if I lobby for a tariff, if one industry lobbies, it'll be applied to everyone else. So there is a free rider problem there. So we are, as India gets out of the pandemic, as I mentioned, I don't think that we'll ever be in a zero COVID world. COVID will become an endemic disease. By that I mean that it will become like the normal flu or something. It has to be managed. But what I mean by getting out of the pandemic is, as we get out of these serious adverse effects of the pandemic, as right now it's much more lethal than the ordinary flu. So as we get out of that, these policies will be important in getting us out of this situation of low growth and slow job creation. All right. So we need both faster growth as well as more jobs of higher quality. All right, I'll end there and now take up questions. I've spoken a lot. I think I've gone past my time limit that I set for myself, but I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitra, for the amazing amazing talk. We have got some questions, and let me just read out these questions to you. The first question is from Shivani Khare, and she asks that in the paper it is mentioned that what India needs is a sustained growth rate of above 8% per annum. So my question is, when India is faring poorly in human development front, can economic growth of 8% and above will lead to inclusive growth?
Will lead to inclusive growth. Yeah, I mean, there is also, one needs to also think of the technological change that is taking place with, cleaner technologies being developed to produce goods. And, in fact, to get to those cleaner technologies, you need growth. You need to be a richer country to be able to afford cleaner technologies. So, if I just go to the environmental Kuznets curve, it's inverse U-shaped, right? So with growth, you're going to go to the, cross that maximum point faster, right? The maximum point is about $5,000 to $6,000 of per capita income. Right? If you can cross that faster, then you would get to the region of the environmental Kuznets curve where growth actually leads to a cleaner environment. And you need the growth to be able to afford the cleaner techniques of cleaner methods of production.
I think Shivani has another question. She has asked openness and trade. in foreign investment most likely played a role in delivering an average growth rate of above 8% per annum. But when one closely observes this, it can be seen that despite a rise in investment, domestic capital formation rate have declined and is driving import-led consumption boom. So can foreign investment be considered as a true indicator of economic growth?
It is not an indicator of economic growth. It is a means to an end. All right. If foreign investment leads to more growth, then that foreign investment is good. If it doesn't, then it's not good. So you need foreign investment. You just don't need foreign investment in any sector. You need foreign investment in growth generating sectors that you could have a lot of foreign investment in labor intensive sectors that would also boost your export. So I don't see a lot of trade-offs there. We haven't been able to attract foreign investment in the right sectors precisely of labor laws and our labor laws, and also laws regarding land acquisition and so on. That's why some of my other policies of setting up 5 or 6 autonomous economic zones, like Professor Arvind Panagaria has talked about a lot, and something that I have also thought a lot about. Those would be really helpful. India doesn't have anything close to what China has had. These big areas where you have a lot of industrial agglomeration, all right, which also have large firms employing 1,000+ workers. That's where we need to attract foreign direct investment. So, and in the presence of these very restrictive factor market laws, on land and labor, and also to a certain extent capital, it's going to be difficult to get the right kind of foreign investment. Yeah.
The next question is from Aditya Sharma, and Aditya asked that you mentioned that average income of unproductive sector is 1/6 of that of the productive sector. You also suggested that people should move from unproductive sectors to the productive ones in order to improve the country's economy. But is it possible to convert the unproductive sectors to productive ones in the near future? If yes, then how can it be done? Shifting labors to productive sectors will require training and resources. Wouldn't we be saving all that by just improving unproductive sectors? So I think what Aditya is asking here in a nutshell is that how do you solve the problem of structural unemployment?
Yeah, productive, it's basically semantics. If you make the unproductive sectors productive, then you basically, workers have moved from unproductive to productive sectors, right? So you basically convert informal sector firms to formal sector firms, is what you're saying. So exactly that is what we are saying. The structure of the economy will change. The way to do it, you cannot force them to become more productive. The only way is, the reason they remain small and informal is because they don't want to face the labor laws, right? So they want to get around those labor laws. So if they are small, they have, let's say, 10, 15 workers, they don't have to kind of adhere to the labor laws. But the law doesn't require them to follow the labor laws. So a law, if you increase the industrial disputes act threshold to say 1,000 workers, and if there are economies of scale as you become larger, then of course you're increasing the incentives of these firms to become larger. Otherwise, currently the incentive is to remain small and informal.
We have a question from Swikriti Tandon, and she asks, you explained how trade policies and trade communication channels improve the economy's growth rate. So I wanted to know what are the factors which influence these channels?
Okay, so one is like exchange of technical information, um, as well as one was what are the things that she mentioned?
She
Could you
mentioned
just?
that you explained how trade policies and trade communication channels improve the economy's growth rate. So she wanted to know what are the factors which influence these channels.
Okay, so as I mentioned, you competition is really important here, right? Um, if I'm a firm, if I'm the owner of a firm in a closed economy, and I only have the technical know-how to produce a product, which was kind of the case when automobiles couldn't be imported in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in India. Then as a producer, as a manufacturer of cars, I know that I don't have any competition. So if anyone who's interested in buying a car has to come to me, and therefore I can get away with selling them low quality cars and charge a pretty high price. Now, the moment I get rid of the tariff, I'm competing with, Ford and with Toyota and Nissan and so on. Then the consumers have other options. All right. So that basically forces me to improve my productivity so that I can basically charge a lower price. Because if I'm more productive, then my cost of production is lower and therefore I can charge a lower price. It also forces me to improve quality, because if my quality is way lower than the quality of cars produced by other foreign manufacturers, no one's going to buy my cars. All right. So basically, I'm becoming more efficient, more productive, right? So productivity growth is going up. But I also kind of also see my workers are interacting with workers in other firms, and some of the knowledge is flowing. So if you look at when you import these cars, what's happening? They set up dealerships, they set up offices, they often also set up some plants to assemble those cars, and so there are knowledge spillovers, right? So or as the cars keep coming, that there's also knowledge incorporated in those cars. You can take apart those cars and see what's inside them. um, and there is more interaction with the outside world, so there is also knowledge flowing. You can also basically import machines to produce components of cars which already have knowledge incorporated based on R&D done in developed countries. So these are all the channels one can think of. I can keep talking about this forever, but I'll stop here. Yeah, go ahead.
Before I take others' question, I have a couple of questions which I wanted to ask you. At one point of time, you have mentioned that there is a need for a reduction in informality, and you have mentioned that the one way to go about it is focusing more on manufacturing sector. Now, historically, Indian manufacturing sector never really took off, right? So, I mean, so how do you propose that? What should be the policies the government should take to reduce the informality?
Yeah, so I mentioned the policies uh, in at the end, the last slide. And some of the policies would apply there. We are stuck in uh, a bad policy equilibrium trap, I would call. And the bad policy equilibrium trap is one of closedness in trade and restrictive factor market regulations. Because if you have uh, if you have restrictions in trade, you're not competing with the rest of the world, and there's no need for factor market reforms. And the factor market reforms are making our manufacturing sector less productive, less competitive, and therefore we don't want the trade, the imported goods to come in, because we cannot compete. one of the reasons given for not signing the RCEP was that, it would hurt our manufacturing sector, all the imports that would come from China. The reason why, Chinese imports hurt the Indian manufacturing sector is precisely because they have larger firms. They have more flexibility in firing workers and therefore in hiring workers and so on. In other words, it boils down to these factor market regulations, right? And of course, if you have very little land that can be acquired by a firm, they cannot grow very large. So the land acquisition is another problem that I mentioned. Therefore, we need these autonomous economic zones very badly. We also need some creative thinking in the liberalization of uh, labor regulations and other kinds of factor market regulations. It's politically, I know it's very hard, and so I commend the government for having made some progress, some of the state governments especially for having made some progress in this regard, especially Rajasthan. But more of that is needed, and the reason why India hasn't done well in manufacturing. Now, you said, India hasn't done well in manufacturing. Then the question I ask is, can it rely on services like finance and business services, real estate and business services? There, the skill levels and education levels are even higher, right? So it becomes, it is a challenge, to put it very bluntly, it is a challenge. It is both an economic challenge and a political challenge.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, I lived in Haryana for a long time, and I've seen, the farmers, they're selling off their lands to big multinationals, and they do not know, they don't have financial literacy. So, many of them, they could not keep their money. They did not know how to invest. So within a few years of time, they are back to what they were, but they did not have the land to fall back on right now. And what the land was, there is, a big MNC producing microchips and providing customer cares to people all over the world. They did not have the education or the skill set to do those jobs. So there is a massive skill gap. So yes, I completely agree with you in the programs that the government is taking, like Skill India or Make in India. Those have promises, but it's time will tell that how far they deliver on those promises. So one question, which I also wanted to know, and some students have also asked that lately we have been hearing this, that the PM has said that we need to be Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, inward looking. So a country like India, which is heavily dependent on international trade, heavily dependent on imports, how far do you think we can be truly self-reliant?
Yeah, so self-reliant was something that Indira Gandhi also talked about, right? And we know the consequences of those policies. I mean, people interpret self-reliance. I mean, the Prime Minister and the government have not been very clear about what they mean by self-reliance. So it has been left open to interpretation. So you could think of self-reliance or self-sufficient, be self-sufficient, right? And in Hindi, I don't think there are different words for that, right? You can be self-reliant and yet, um, trade, right? But if you are more specific, do you mean self-sufficient, meaning that you don't trade, right? So we don't know what self-reliance means in this context. I mean, they wanted to be self-reliant in vaccines, and then they didn't order, imported vaccines from, let's say, Pfizer and Moderna. And some people have argued that, those are vaccines of the future and should have been ordered. But we know what kind of repercussions, consequences that self-reliance had. So I think, one has to be very careful when talking about self-reliance. Um, I would leave it at that. Yeah. I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, I mean, we have a lot of questions, right? We have, close to 25 questions waiting. I know that, we do not have that much of time. I do not want to hold you back for so long. So I just ask you one last question, before we end this session. So this is also asked by one of our students, Swikriti, and she has asked that in the last 1.5 years, we have seen an increased digitization. Right? So she asked that, uh, do you think COVID-19 has accelerated digitization, and will these type of workspaces become the new normal, or will the things go back to how they were? And how do you think this will affect the economy? Now, yeah.
Okay, so let me say that, for about 1.5 years, I taught online. And with the brief gap in between, last fall, we did some in-person teaching, fall of 2020. But then, even though there was no vaccination, we were all masked and there was a lot of social distancing in large classrooms. We had very few students, and each class was divided into a couple of sections. We offered hybrid so that we could offer online for the students who wanted online, and faculty had that option. So we tried also in person last year, but it was not really the kind of in person we have normally. So real in-person teaching here started 3 weeks ago, and I can tell you that I had just forgotten what the difference is. I mean, I saw the energy in the classroom, and how happy the students were, and they were, there was much greater engagement in what was going on in class. So there is no real substitute for in-person teaching, let me say that. So if if the pandemic is controlled and managed, I'm sure we will go back to much more in-person teaching. But I also think that what the pandemic has taught us, what all the Zoom teaching has taught us, is that you can teach from anywhere. So basically, you're going to see more knowledge flows all across the world. By that, I mean, the kind of lecture that I'm giving over Zoom, those are going to continue. And sometimes, if in many parts of India, you don't have good quality in-person teaching. So then you could replace that with higher quality online teaching. So holding quality constant, as we economists do, hold something constant, I think in-person teaching is better. But if the quality also varies along with moving to this other mode of teaching, from in-person to online or Zoom, then then it's a different issue. So we can actually expand education a lot, from that there will be a lot of like, for example, Jindal University will be teaching, I foresee in the future, not just in Sonipat, but it'll have a lot of online classes and will be educating a lot of people all over India. So that's the future I see, right? And that'll happen with all good universities in India.
I mean, you're very right. I mean, in the last one year, we realized that the classrooms have become literally without a boundary, right? So, you're from New York, you're sitting in our classroom, talking to our students and the faculty and the researchers. So this wouldn't have been possible had there not been, this interruption.
Right.
And as far as you mentioned that, probably in the near future, Jindal will be teaching students all over the world. We're actually doing that, right? So we have launched an online course where we have students from all over the world, from the US, from Japan, from Africa, from Middle East, all over the places. So I think this is the future, and this is to stay.
Yeah.
So what I think, what Swikriti also wanted to know is that apart from academia, so how do you think that the other sectors of the economy, they will respond to this disruption and going forward? So will they be half digitized, or will they be completely go back to normal physical working space, and how will this affect the economy?
Yeah, so I don't think this is the last pandemic we're going to see. There will be more pandemics in the future. So it helps us, it helps firms plan for future pandemics as well,
Sure.
right? So they know that they can diversify their production by having factories in many parts of the world, so that if there is a pandemic in one part of the world, they can ramp up their production somewhere else, right? And so so you are going to see more diversification, I think, right? Not only for PPE, but also for other kinds of goods, right? You need supplies of other goods during a pandemic. So that's one thing. It is going to accelerate offshoring for sure, because it's easy to supervise production sitting in New York. I can supervise production in Gurgaon, for example, right? And one thing it might reduce is travel, right? Travel, it might hurt the travel industry a little bit, but everyone is very eager to travel right now. So it's hard to predict. But lots of such changes, one can think about, what else can happen, but the mode of production will change quite a bit. More diversification, even more offshoring than we've seen before.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitra. I have lots of other questions waiting, so I would request the attendees, if you have questions which have not been answered, you can send those questions to me. I will collate those questions, and I'll share some selected questions with Professor Mitra. And Professor Mitra,
Yes.
if you have some spare time, and if you can answer
Sure.
those questions, that would be. So
Sure.
thank you very much. It was an amazing talk. And I'm sure that everybody who has been present here, they have enjoyed it as much as I did. It's been great to have you here. And once this thing, once this pandemic is over and things get back to normal and we resume travel, then we really hope to host you in our campus. It's a beautiful campus. You can see our
Thank you so
background.
much. Yeah.
And next time you're in Delhi, please let us know. We'll be very happy to have you in our campus for a day, to have interact with our faculty, researchers, and students. So
thanks for having me, give this talk. It was a real pleasure. There were some really interesting questions. I was really impressed by the questions by the students, and I was really happy to give this talk. And even though I would love to visit India right now, the pandemic kind of makes it harder. It's possible now, but makes it harder. And I'm looking forward to times when travel will be easier, and hopefully I'll see you all in person. Thank you very
absolutely.
much.
So please let us know whenever you're here. And once again,
Right.
thank you very much for joining with us. And I thank all the attendees who have come here and joined us. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye now.